Hi, biodiversity conservation can be done in ex-situ and in-situ conservation methods. In the previous videos, we have discussed the in-situ conservation strategies. In this video, I am going to talk about ex-situ conservation methodologies. Ex-situ conservation meaning off-site conservation. The organism is removed or taken from its natural habitat and put it in a new habitat, and the organism will be preserved, organism will be protected in this new habitat. So in ex-situ conservation, protecting an endangered species, variety or breed outside its natural habitat, that's a main distribution feature of the ex-situ conservation when compared to the in-situ conservation. In-situ conservation always happening in the natural habitat. Ex-situ conservation happens outside its natural habitat. In this new habitat, the organism is maintained and breed under controlled conditions. In these controlled conditions, we can actually control the activities of the animal in such a way that the selection pressures won't be there, the natural selection pressures won't be on the animal, and the stress due to the competition is also avoided. So such manipulated habitat, artificial selection is occurring. This ex-situ conservation is done by translocating a part of population from the threatened habitat. If there is a habitat loss is happening and which may leads to the extinction of a species, what we do, we will take a small portion of this threatened population and translocate it into another habitat. This another habitat may be a man-made, totally man-made habitat, or it may be another forest which is not the natural habitat of the animal, but we are protecting the animal in the new habitat. So we will be providing food, shelter, and everything for the organism in this new habitat. The new location may be within or outside the species' natural geographical range, but it will be definitely outside its ecological niche. In this new habitat, we are protecting it from the predators and the mortality. We will be giving the medical treatment and everything to make sure that the organism is alive. Uh, so in the new habitat, when the organism is transferred to a new habitat, there will be alterations in the living environment, reproductive pattern, and access to the resources. There will be behavioral changes in the animal because they are in the new atmosphere, new environment. There are different methods used for the ex-situ conservation. The first step of any ex-situ conservation is the identification of species to be conserved, because unlike in-situ conservation, we are conserving only limited number of species in ex-situ conservation. So we need to identify which species are needing this ex-situ mode of conservation. So once we identify the organism, we will adopt suitable ex-situ methods for conservation. The ex-situ conservation may be a short-term program or a long-term program. In short term, what we do, the propagation and the reintroduction. If we see a sudden decrease in a population of particular species, so what we do, we will take a portion of the animal, a portion of the organism, and reproduce in a new habitat, and it will be reintroduced into the its own habitat. So we can do that type of ex-situ conservation for short time. Maybe we can actually reduce the habitat loss in some way if we could, and then we can actually reintroduce into its natural habitat. For long term, what we do, the captive breeding and the propagation. So the the organism will get adapted to the ex-situ conditions. These ex-situ conditions, the methods can be live collection like the botanical gardens or zoological garden or zoos, or in-field gene banks. So the ex-situ conservation can be done either in the living form, the organism is living, the tree is planted in a forest or a protected area, or animal in an area. If they are in a living form, we can actually either conserve the organism in its living condition, or we can conserve in a stored condition. We can store it in a gene bank like seed bank, semen bank, or ovules, tubules, plant tissue culture, DNA, everything can be stored. Just like we are storing something in a refrigerator, we can actually store the organism as uh, as using different techniques for long time. So one is storage. In storage condition, these organisms are not in the living mode. It is, they are not biochemically or physiologically active, but in live collection they are physiologically active. So different methods can be used. There are different objectives for ex-situ conservation. They include rescue threatened and endangered species. If an species is at the verge of extinction, we can actually save the species by using ex-situ conservation method. In that way, we should select the organisms to be conserved in ex-situ mode. And for any ex-situ conservation, scientific collection and long-term preservation is needed, because in a preservation method, in a conservation effort of ex-situ conservation, we can conserve only a limited number of species in a limited number of numbers. So the genetic diversity and species diversity should be conserved for this ex-situ conservation. So scientific collection and long-term preservation is required. Then remove or reduce pressure from wild collecting, because sometimes we need wild animals or wild plants for scientific research or industrial purposes. So if we have an ex-situ mode of conservation, we can actually take samples from that one. If you want to study something about the tiger, you can go to the zoo and study how it is behaving, or what are the properties, if you want to do a research on tiger behavior. But if there is no zoo, there is no ex-situ mode of conservation, you need to go to the wild and study. One point, it is very difficult and dangerous, and it is not good for the animal. So in that way, we can actually prevent the exploitation of wild resources by keeping them in the ex-situ mode of conservation. Sometimes we need some plant samples for research. So if you have an ex-situ mode of conservation, we can get it from the botanical garden rather than going to the wild and collecting the samples. So that's one objective. Make available materials for conservation, education and public awareness. So the conserved materials will be exhibited for education and public awareness purposes. It is complement training and research, because most of the botanical gardens and zoos and everything is having associated research departments. Conserve organism for reintroduction, reinforcement, habitat restoration and management. So all this ex-situ mode of conservation is actually complementing the in-situ mode of conservation, because if the habitat become normal, we can actually reintroduce our organism. Or if the population is declining, if you have ex-situ mode of conserved organism, we can actually introduce few more individuals into the habitat to strengthen the population strength. So maybe it can be used for habitat restoration, especially trees can be used, or the plants can be used, or habitat management also we can use this ex-situ mode conserved organism. And advantages. The main advantage is that by using ex-situ conservation, we can supplement in-situ conservation, which can be used in some way, ecosystem restoration or reintroduction of species, or translocation and introduction into a similar but another like similar habitat. Assisted migration. Sometimes because of the habitat fragmentation, animals may not be able to move from one habitat to the another, or one ecosystem to the another. So in those cases, we can actually capture the organism and transport, like it's called assisted migration. The ex-situ mode of conservation can be help to breed endangered species if the population is really low. Another advantage is like unlike in-situ mode of conservation, the ex-situ mode of conservation is applicable for wild and cultivated varieties. One thing is that we need to conserve all the wild varieties of plants and animals and microorganisms. But another point is that we also need to conserve our cultivated varieties, because that is directly act as the food source for us. So the cultivated rice, wheat, like things like that, or the poultry or cows, the varieties we are actually cultivating or farming need to be conserved. That can be done only using ex-situ conservation, not using in-situ conservation. So another advantage is that high survival and breeding rates, because it is in a protected environment. It is protected from all threats. So in ex-situ conservation, animal survival and breeding rates of organisms are really high. And this ex-situ conservation is conserving genetic as well as species diversity. And it is helpful in education and raising awareness. Most of the in-situ conservation sites are so closed, so we cannot actually go in there and study. It helps the education, research and training in some way, but not as much as the ex-situ conservation do. It also provides research opportunities for studying biology of endangered species, understanding the threats to the species, not damaging the natural population. You can actually take the samples without damaging the natural population. Developing animal handling techniques. So if you want to, like, the studies like that can be done during ex-situ conservation methods. It also raises money for conservation programs, like, because the botanical gardens and the zoos, aquariums are the one of the main tourist attractions. So people used to pay for entry. So those fee can be used for conservation practices. So the ex-situ conservation is actually economical business. It has some disadvantages for ex-situ conservation. One thing is that poor fitness. If the organism is grown under ex-situ condition, like in a zoo or in a botanical garden, eventually it will lose its fitness, its ability to live in the wild. So it will become low resistance levels for long-term ex-situ conservation. So if you keep the animal, especially animals, if you keep an animal for a long time in for many generations in a zoo, it may lose its ability to live and survive in the wild condition. So in those cases, reintroduction of the species to another habitat is impossible. So that's one problem. Reduced fitness during ex-situ conservation, especially if you are doing it for many generations. Next thing is that artificial habitat. In all ex-situ conservation, we are using an artificial habitat. In those habitat, the movement of organisms, especially animals, are very restricted, and it is forced proximity to humans. Most of the animals don't like to be with human beings. But in zoo and everything, people are always coming, huge crowds are coming, and they are coaching in very close proximity. That used to disturb these animals. Environmental homogeneity, because they are seeing the same place again and again, unlike in the wild. Then high levels of inbreeding, which is bad, which will cause a loss of genetic diversity, and it will also reduce the survival rate. It affects biological integrity and even morphology of the organism if it is kept in ex-situ conservation for a long time. And there is no natural selection and evolution is happening in the ex-situ conservation in most cases. So those are the disadvantages of using an artificial habitat for conservation. And another disadvantage is that in ex-situ conservation we can conserve only very limited number of species. If you are following an ex-situ conservation, in-situ conservation mode, we are actually conserving a huge geographical area. So known and unknown organisms within this geographical area will be conserved. Unlike that, in ex-situ conservation, we are selecting few species and conserving only those species. So that's one disadvantage. High facilities and financial investment is required for ex-situ conservation. Thank you.